Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth.
We come now to question 59 in our ongoing series on the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And if you've been following along, you know that we have been breaking down more recently what the Westminster Divines have had to say with respect first to the Ten Commandments and now more specifically to the fourth commandment, that commandment which calls on us to honor the Sabbath day. Well, question 59 asks this question about that day. Which day of the 7 has God appointed to be the weekly Sabbath? And the Westminster Divines answered this way. From the beginning of the world to the resurrection of Christ, God appointed the 7th day of the week to be the weekly Sabbath, and the first day of the week ever since, to continue to the end of the world, which is the Christian Sabbath. Let me read through that answer one more time. From the beginning of the world to the resurrection of Christ, God appointed the 7th day of the week to be the weekly Sabbath, and the first day of the week ever since to continue to the end of the world, which is the Christian Sabbath. Now, if you remember, all along as we've been going through these questions, I have been praising my theological ancestors for their capacity to be profoundly concise, to answer these questions with a richness that's found in just picking the exact right words. And while I actually have some areas of disagreement in this answer, I still have to give credit along those lines. This is a very concise answer, taking positions on a number of issues, one of which is the relationship between the Lord's Day and the Hebrew Sabbath. And what the Westminster Divines are doing here is affirming an identity between the two. They're affirming that they are exactly one and the same thing, that in essence the only distinction is the day of the week in which it is celebrated. That I'm not so sure about. And I mentioned before that I will not engage in debates about whether or not we should be worshiping on Saturday or worshiping on Sunday. And I'm also admitted that one of the reasons why I won't engage in those debates is because I don't know that I can win. And one of the reasons I'm not so confident that I can win is found right here in the Shorter Catechism, because one of the things that our fathers did is not only ask the questions and answer the questions, they also provided proof texts, those parts of the Bible that the fathers believed taught the doctrine that they were promulgating. So when we come to that section of this answer, the second half of the answer, and the first day of the week ever since to continue to the end of the world, which is the Christian Sabbath, we are provided with 3 proof texts. The first one is in Acts 20, verse 7, where we read this, "And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight." 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, where we read, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God has prospered him, that there may be no gatherings when I come." And finally, the third proof text is John chapter 20, verses 19 through 26, where we read, Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Jesus, and stood in the midst, and saith unto them, Peace be unto you. And when he said so, he showed them his hands and his side. Then were the disciples glad when they saw the Lord. Then Jesus said to them again, Peace be unto you. As my Father has sent me, even so I send you. And when he said this, he breathed on them, and said unto them, Receive ye the Holy Ghost. Whosoever sins you remit, they are remitted unto them, and whosoever sins you retain, they are retained. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said unto him, We've seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Except I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days again his disciples were within, and Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst of them, and said, Peace be unto you. Do you notice something missing from these texts? Nowhere in these texts does it say, okay, the Sabbath was the seventh day of the week, and now it's going to be the first day of the week. You do have, clearly and straightforwardly, information that suggests, at least in the first two texts, that it was the habit of God's people to meet together on the first day. I don't have any wish to dispute that. I can't believe anybody would want to dispute that. But it is a long way from saying that the disciples gathered together on the first day of the week to say that what God ordained as the Sabbath day has now changed. In fact, this assumption is a failure to follow a fundamental principle of sound hermeneutics, and that's this, that we don't confuse the accuracy of a historical account with the teaching of the Bible. That is, the Bible accurately teaches that these people did meet on this day. It doesn't say they don't meet on Saturday. It doesn't say that when they meet on this day, they're replacing the old meetings on Saturday. It doesn't say any of that. It just says that they met on this day. Far less does it say, this is what you're supposed to do. You know, when the Bible says that Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, it's not saying, so this is what you ought to do. It's giving a historically accurate description of a grievous sin. For all we know, these people could have been wrong for meeting on this day. The text doesn't say. Well, I'm sorry not to be much more help than that. I'm unpersuaded that they're making their case here. That doesn't mean that the case can't be made, hasn't been made. I've just not seen it to my own satisfaction. But I'm also more than happy to submit myself to the church on this issue. It is perhaps one of the most overlooked engines that drove the first American Revolution. When we study those events, which is itself becoming increasingly rare in the government's schools, when we study the events that led up to the American Revolution, it's easy to sort of pick out and highlight the ideology that drove it, to pick out and cover the dramatic events along the way, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, Paul Revere's Ride, those kinds of things, the shot heard around the world. But we can miss some of the subtle things that helped bring it along. Among those would be the committees of correspondence. Now, I venture to guess that there are some of you out there who've never heard of the committees of correspondence, and others who may have a vague recollection of them. Well, here's what they were. They were simply men of sound minds, sound perspectives, who were watching the circumstances going on around them, and who were communicating with each other their thoughts on what was going on and what ought to be going on and that kind of thing. There was a conversation through the mail that informed, educated, inspired, brought together, frankly, the very men who we look back on as our founding fathers. Those kinds of relationships, the capacity to work together and labor side by side and to risk together, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in large part through these committees of correspondence. Now, we live in a day where communication is so much easier on the one hand, but so much more crowded on the other hand. If John Adams were to send a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1773, I venture to guess that Thomas Jefferson had to wait a while to get it as it traveled from Boston down to Virginia. But I also guess that when the mail came to Thomas Jefferson, he didn't have a whole bunch of flyers or a whole bunch of spam emails vying for his attention. He probably opened up that letter and read it. Well, we're in a place and a day where anyone can send anyone a message, easy peasy puddin' pie. But there's just so many of them. So much noise. My hope and my prayer is that the Jesus Changes Everything podcast is able in your life to cut through that noise. That it is helpful enough, biblical enough, faithful enough that it can silence or at least quiet the buzzing around us and be a help to us in thinking rightly and clearly. But it's also been my hope from day one for this podcast to be, as much as possible, a conversation. Two ways. I ask you regularly for your thoughts, for your comments. I ask you regularly, what would you like me to talk about? I ask you regularly, tell me where you think I'm wrong. I want to talk with you, not just to you. Because I think that's how things change. When I started the Highland Studies Center some 25 years ago, one of our mottos there was this: education is conversation. That is still true. And we're here putting out this podcast day after day after day. We're publishing blog pieces day after day after day. We're putting out the Ask RC podcast day after day after day, all in an attempt to begin conversations, to cultivate conversations, to grow conversations, so that we can mature together. Now, I'm asking you for two things. One, get in the conversation. Send me a message. Comment at rcsprouljr.com. Comment on my YouTube channel. I want to hear from you. But secondly, again, I'm looking for partners. For people who agree that Jesus Changes Everything can be a help, can cultivate these relationships, can be a blessing to the people of God as we live through a kind of cultural exile. As we live through a drought of God's Word. If you think Jesus Changes Everything can be a part of the solution, would you please become a part of the team? Would you partner with us? It's very simple. All you have to do is go to rcsprouljr.com. There's a donate button there. You can follow that procedure. Again, easy peasy puddin' pie. Nothing difficult about it. My hope is that you're finding this podcast to be a blessing. By the way, let me suggest this too. If you haven't yet, please take the time to go to YouTube, the RC Sproul Jr. channel, and check out today's Ask RC. It asks the question, it seeks to answer the question, why do evangelicals spend so little time talking about the biblical doctrine of adoption? Thank you for listening. We're going to once again do a top 5 for our Curating Your Movie Library segment this week. My precious wife is out running errands and I need to get this taken care of. And I've determined that we're going to do a top 5 Disney classic cartoon features. Top 5 Disney classic cartoon features, but partly because I don't think the newer ones are worthy to be compared with the old ones, we're going to stick with the old ones, the classic ones. You know, there was a sense when I was growing up that Disney movies were almost like their own sort of subcategory of fairy tales, like Grimm's fairy tales, in the sense that whatever they did, it was just exactly the right thing. I didn't look at it like these stories actually pre-existed Disney. The only Peter Pan I knew was Disney's Peter Pan. The only Pinocchio I knew was Disney's Pinocchio. As we got older, and after they started making these after I was grown, because I started going to the movies right about the time that Disney himself died, and Disney really struggled with success in their feature cartoons. At that point, things began to change, and so there was this sort of gap. You could almost look at it like maybe at the edge of the old was The Jungle Book, which was made in 1967, and the beginning of the new didn't come around until the early 90s. So here's my top 5. I'm going to go backwards, and I'm going to start with something that maybe isn't quite in fitting with my list, because it's not exactly a feature-length film. I'm going to put at number 5, Steamboat Willie. This was the original Mickey Mouse cartoon, but it was not that original. That is one of the reasons why it's on the list, is because it's the original of Mickey. Second reason it's on the list, however, is that it is playing off of one of the great classics of the silent film era, starring my favorite silent film star, Buster Keaton, who played the lead, or who starred in The General. And Steamboat Willie is based on that original story. It's a lot of fun. It's very good. It's number 5 on my list. Number 4 on my list, again, very close to the edge of the new. It's The Lady and the Tramp. How can you not love The Lady and the Tramp? Not so much one of those stories that comes out of medieval fairy tales at all, but nevertheless charming and romantic and beautifully done and fun. I would put this basically by itself among all of the Disney movies that were built around talking animals. That is, this is so superior to the Robin Hood version with the animals, or the Rescuers, or even, I would argue, 101 Dalmatians, although I have a little bitter spot in my heart for 101 Dalmatians because I went to go see it as a 5-year-old, and when I got to the theater, the line went around the block, and it sold out, and I didn't get to see it. That was a rough day for me. So, number 5, Steamboat Willie. Number 4, The Lady and the Tramp. Number 3, Snow White. You gotta love Snow White. I love Snow White for 2 reasons. 1, the comic element coming out of these dwarfs is just really, really fun. You gotta love the dwarfs. But ironically, the other thing that's so good about it is the scariness of the queen, and the scariness of the queen in her guise as the witch. When she comes and brings that apple to Snow White, or when she's being chased by the 7 dwarfs, that was pretty creepy for a cartoon and for a kid. Very intense, very well done. So that's going to be number 3 on my list. Number 2, and this is close. The last 2 are very, very close. In fact, I'm going to call them 1A and 1B. And I'm going to go, I don't even know how to pick which one to go with first. 1B, we'll do it alphabetically. 1B, Peter Pan. Peter Pan. Now, I just love the story of Peter Pan. I love Captain Hook. And by the way, I love every Peter Panish movie that's ever been made. In fact, I think there's never been a bad Peter Pan movie. That is, I love this Disney version. I love Hook. I love the Johnny Depp story of the writer of Peter Pan. Just every Peter Pan version, I'm just crazy about. It's a great story, great characters, lots of fun. Last, 1A, Pinocchio. Oh man, it's heart-wrenching. The moral story is heart-wrenching. The love of Geppetto is inspiring. Maybe I left your favorite one out. Maybe I made a mistake. Well, that's not very likely. I'd love to hear from you. If you think I left one out, again, I'm not counting The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Pocahontas, any of these ones that sort of came out after I was mostly grown up. Not interested in having on this list. But I'd love to hear from you. What are your favorites of these cartoon Disney feature films?
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.